Welcome back to the Wealth Transfer Podcast. Today we have Sarah Lashua with American National Bank and Trust, and she is a trust officer, a tax LLM, and a licensed attorney. And her job on the day-to-day basis is being a corporate trustee for trusts. And so I'm super excited to hear from Sarah and hear about the parts of trust administration and the estate that happen after someone has passed away. Like, what does it look like when you're managing your estate, or when your estate's being managed after you've already passed, and how do you set those things up from the front end to make sure they go well? So Sarah, tell us about your background. How did you get into being a trust officer?
So I did tax compliance work for most of my career after law school and my LLM. And I worked in public accounting. And then tax is not for the faint of heart. And I was tired of my life revolving around deadlines almost every single month of the calendar year. It's not just April 15th. Every month there's something. And so I had done tax returns for a bank, their trust department. And I had lunch with someone who was retiring, and she and I talked about me taking over her role. And so that it just kind of happened. I wanted to use some people skills and my relationship building skills. So I just kind of fell into it. So
And I think a lot of people, when they think about trust, they think about, okay, I need to name my child or my son, my daughter as my trustee. I need to get my brother, my sister to agree to this. I need to figure out how my wife could handle this when I pass away. And you obviously are the other side of this, which is sometimes that's not the best. Actually, in many cases, that's not the best idea. It's better to name a corporate trustee who's not maybe caught up in all of the family dynamics or drama. Tell us what a corporate trustee does.
So even if I wasn't in this role, I would tell people they should have a corporate trustee. And it's for a couple of reasons. When you appoint someone to be a trustee of a trust, you're giving them a lot of responsibility, a lot of legal liability, and you are changing their relationship with the beneficiary. So let's say you set up a trust and you want your brother or the uncle of the beneficiary to be the trustee. Now at Thanksgiving, it's not just about pass the stuffing. It's about, and you didn't give me the money for that car I wanted. So you're completely changing and adding a different dynamic to familial relationships and to personal relationships. So a corporate trustee is a great thing to have because they're a neutral third party. They have resources available to them. They have a wealth of experience, and it's kind of a slam dunk when you have, obviously there are stories where people didn't have great experiences with corporate trustees, but it's a great, easy professional management of the assets that you want for your children or your family member or whomever you're trying to benefit.
And so what does a corporate trustee do on a day-to-day basis? You know, they're managing a number of trusts. What's the average day-to-day for you?
I would say on average, we get a lot of phone calls with people making certain requests. Maybe they have a home repair they need, or have a car repair, or they want to buy a new car. And then there are also beneficiaries that we don't hear from. We set up, either they don't take from their trust, or maybe they're set up on a monthly allowance. And so our day is also about reviewing documents, talking to people, potential customers, about how we can help them manage their assets and achieve their goals. And every day is different, which is kind of nice. So that's a little different than tax, and another reason why this was a good transition. So
Well, and I can imagine you mentioned the dynamics of a family member having to deal with somebody bugging them for a distribution. How does it like what kind of, I feel like as a corporate trustee, you probably have to get in kind of the nitty-gritty of family and relationships and needs, and so how do you feel like you have to manage those sorts of relationships and the aspects of your clients?
well, it depends on the document as to how nitty gritty we need to get. But if you have a document that says they're allowed distributions of income or principal, but you have to consider other resources, you have to kind of get into those. What are those resources? What other income do you have? What other assets do you have to meet this need that you have. And so those can be awkward conversations because I know I personally try to respect people's privacy, but also having to meet the terms of that document and do what we're asked, what we're asked to do. So,
Well, that brings up another great point, which I talk to a lot of attorneys about, is how you write your document really matters. And sometimes there are, certain attorneys that have certain types of language they like to put into their trust documents. And then other attorneys would say, be careful with that. And so what are some of the pitfalls you've seen in how trust documents are written that make it really hard to operate the trust?
pot trusts. So, a pot trust is a trust with multiple beneficiaries, and they can be set up any way in multiple different ways. You can have distributions made equally to all the beneficiaries. You can say you can make distributions without trying to equalize this, but it's just inevitably, it becomes a problem because you have multiple people with interests in the same asset. Some are taking, some are not. Some, and in addition to that, they're probably siblings. And then you have your sibling dynamics. And it's a recipe for a mess. So my number one thing is do not do pot trust. Just don't do it. Unless it's a trust where you're just distributing income equally every year. And there's no, that's very straightforward. For example, a trust that has a lot of mineral assets, they receive mineral income, and you're just distributing the income evenly to the three beneficiaries. That's fine, but I will say you still can have family dynamics in that. So, I always say estate planning is planning for what you're not planning for. Because when you do your estate planning, you imagine everything's going to happen a certain way. Everyone's going to behave a certain way. Everyone's going to get along. That's just not the reality of the situation, especially if you have a trust that lasts for 2 or more generations. And some of these people might be infants when you're setting this up. You just don't know. So I would say, in always considering how can people get out of this? How can a trustee, whether it be a corporate trustee or an individual, if it's not working, how can they resign? What if my beneficiary wants to use somebody else? How can they make that decision? So I would say building in some flexibility is so important because the worst kind of document is a document where you paint yourself into a corner and you don't know how to resolve the situation, whether it be a corporate trustee or an individual trustee or you're a beneficiary in an untenable situation. That lack of flexibility can really impact the experience of those involved.
In those situations, can you go to the court and get them to make a decision on something that feels untenable if the document is really that strict?
Yes, you can go to court. You can enter into a settlement agreement without the court, depending on the terms of the document. There are options. Those options just get to be expensive because you get attorneys involved and time consuming if you have to go to court to seek a modification. So sometimes those automatic triggers in the document that will allow you to resolve things without an expensive legal battle, and nobody, wants to get, hate to say, no one wants to get attorneys involved.
Yeah,
I mean, we do. We love the legal community, but it can get really expensive.
totally.
So
Now, when a trust comes to the bank and says, or maybe the bank is named as a corporate trustee, or you found somebody and you end up acquiring a client or consulting with a client, and you become the corporate trustee. When should a trust have a corporate trustee? Is there too small of a trust for that, or is there too big of a trust for a certain type of bank?
well, you want to make sure that it's of the size that it makes economic sense, both for the trust and this beneficiary and the bank or the corporate trustee, whoever, whether it be a bank or somebody else. And I know that $1 million mark is ideal, but if you have 3 kids who each have $600,000 trusts, so aggregating that to 1.8 million, that will often be done to kind of make things more economic for everyone who is involved.
And if you like when you've been helping administer trusts, what are some of the red flags you've seen in whether it's in trusts or whether it's in the family situations or maybe you guys do administration of wills as well, or is it just trusts?
Yes, so we do estates as well. I would say the one red flag is, so there are a lot of things I look at. I've been doing this a lot recently. I've been reviewing some documents and what are the assets of the trust? Is there liquidity in the trust to manage these assets? And that's not specific to a corporate trustee. That's just something you should consider. Yeah, I want to put this 100 acres of land in this trust, but there's no cash to pay for the property taxes. Or who's keeping track of the activity on the land and things like that? Do we need to pay someone to go out there and check? Or so there are, what is the liquidity for just administration, expenses and fees and taxes and things like that? How document written? What kind of flexibility is in that document? Is it really rigid? Are there terms in the document that make it almost impossible to administer? And I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, it's just that example of painting yourself into a corner where maybe you don't have the assets to achieve the purpose of the trust. At that point, you would consider terminating the trust. Who are the beneficiaries? Is it a pot trust? That's question number one. And is it all kinds of people need trusts, whether it's for the reasons are endless, the potential beneficiaries, I mean, any permutation you can think of. But is it someone who's going to be really difficult that all you're going to do is just butt heads with them and there's always going to be strife and drama? Is that really something? Are there siblings involved? What's their relationship like? So it's kind of looking at the soft stuff as well as the numbers as to whether a trust is going to be accepted by a corporate trustee. So are there liability issues that could blow up in the, is this a toxic waste dump? Well, we're probably not gonna want something like that. Neither is an individual. Just because of, I think it's important to understand the liability for a fiduciary when you're creating a trust, whether it be an individual or a corporate trustee. There's a lot of liability involved. There's liability as far as executing the document in the way that it's written, and it's a fiduciary responsibility. So there are responsibilities in the code of things that you're required to do. Prudent investor rules, duty to disclose, things like that. And if you don't meet those, if you don't know what those are or how as an individual to meet those fiduciary obligations, you can be personally liable. So I think that answers.
Yeah, the fiduciary aspect of any trustee or even any person. I think oftentimes we hear the horror stories of, usually it's in an estate, like administrating or an executor for an estate, but oftentimes I think there's personal trustees as well. And there's almost doing things for personal gain or doing things that are self-dealing. And you realize, like, I don't think you understood the definitions of fiduciary. Like, by taking this on, it wasn't so that you would have the upper hand in getting what you wanted. It was so that you would
Right.
do something, you would be selfless in making the best decisions for the entity and for the beneficiaries, not for yourself. Have you seen that where a trustee is also a beneficiary?
Yeah, that can happen. That can happen a lot. And I mean, at that point, you're not going to sue yourself, right? And so the purpose of that trust is probably for creditor protection or keeping. In Texas, we have community property laws that will protect your inherited share from someone, in theory, depending on if you mix it up, and that can get too tedious to get into. But in other states, they don't have those protections of inheritances. So that's a way to keep your assets kind of separate from your spouse's assets. So
Well, and I
go ahead.
and what I was even thinking was, I mean, in general, one of the biggest problems I think across all wealth transfer scenarios is sibling rivalry over assets, right? So it's like, power struggles and who's got the dynamic of where they're in control and what are they doing. And then all of a sudden, these 70% of the time it ends in fights where the siblings or the even if there maybe are other heirs, the relationship between the heirs breaks down over money. And so I think like
Yeah.
one of these big things to solve is how do you set things up so that you avoid the problems, the relationship problems that are going to, and so you brought up one, which is have a corporate trustee so that there's not this power dynamic inside of the family, but also how do you make sure that, and you brought up another one, how do you make sure that the estate is well funded, the trust or the estate is well funded to be able to deal with their liquid assets? Or how do you make sure that there's not liquid assets that people are going to have different desires for? Like, well, we need to sell that. I want to use it. I want, all these different competing desires. And there's maybe some structure that takes years of sort of planning and working through so that when you pass on, your kids don't fight. So it's just a thought that I often have is like, how do we help prevent these fights, both in how we write documents and how we set up the family for success so that you're not stuck in a bad situation?
Right.
Yeah.
So I talked to someone once we were talking about their estate plan, and they had 2 condos in Florida on the beach. One was nicer than the other, and they had 3 sons. And I was just sitting there, I see problems here. And they said, we love all their wives and everyone gets along. And I said, well, they get along now, but you don't know, you don't know what can happen in 10, 15, 20 years, especially when money's involved. Money brings out the worst and the best in people. And so when you're doing your plan and you have limited assets such that you can make it equal among everyone, you need to consider. So that's that flexibility. What if you need to have something in your document talking about if one of the beneficiaries, I said, don't do a pot trust. Don't do a pot trust. But let's, for example, say you have 900 acres of land in North Texas. Well, I wouldn't suggest doing a pot trust, and again, nothing I'm saying is considered legal advice. Please consult with your CPAs or your attorneys. I am not giving legal advice. Please, so you're professionals. But you might consider doing 3 trusts that have a third, a third, a third interest, undivided interest in that 900 acres. But then what if somebody wants out? And not all 900 acres aren't going to be equal. What's on a road? What is so far? There's no access to that. That value is all different, right? So you just have to think about, it seems cumbersome to think about every issue, but the one issue you should think about is, what if this goes sideways? How can I have these assets, I have a purpose for my estate plan or this trust or my estate, but if this doesn't go the way I want it to go, what is a good resolution to this? Can I allow them to be bought out, or 2 of the 3 people can vote to sell certain acreage? Do I want to divide that land up and deed it 300 acres to each trust instead of having them all have a third, a third, a third? I mean, you have a lot of real estate experience. I'm sure you have seen something like this where it's a piece of property owned by multiple beneficiaries and it turns, you can't sell it. One person doesn't want to sell it, or they don't agree on the price. And all those scenarios.
Every iteration, especially if we're talking about land, but every iteration of multiple beneficiaries owning a property together, I've seen, like, there's one that is very close to home that I see, 100 acres. The 3 siblings do not talk. And so one of the siblings has locked the gates with his own locks and no one's allowed on. No one's maintaining the land. It was like, you're literally squandering your inheritance because you're mad at your brothers and you're unwilling to, and, some want to sell it. And then there's nieces and nephews trying to buy out other shares. And you're like, this is an absolute mess. And that's only 100 acres, right? And that's
Yeah.
just one I thought of, but you're absolutely right. And then there's other ones too, where there's maybe power dynamics over time where one sibling has acquired more. Maybe they were in the family business and they bought some of the other property. And so they've got more. And then there's jealousy and all the iterations that are possible. Especially, I feel like this is why we have such a big opportunity, because there's so much of it in real estate. Because real estate is the biggest illiquid, besides maybe businesses, real estate's such an illiquid asset. And many times, like if we're talking a stock portfolio, if we're talking mineral interest, if we're talking, there's a lot of things that are a little bit easier to divide. But when we think about like, the build, like the condos are a great example. There's really, other than maybe splitting up weeks that we get to borrow or to use it or utilize it. But even then, are we going to rent it part of the time? Are you allowed to use your weeks to rent it? Like all these other decisions that come up, not just dividing usage, but dividing how we use it and how we're allowed to use it. And so I find that real estate creates some of the biggest pain points for those that have inherited something. Now, I'm curious, do you have any of those? Keep them as anonymous as you'd like to, but do you have any of those either horror stories or even just good stories that you would share either from estates or trusts that you've dealt with?
I would like to say that I don't have any personal horror stories, which is good. I have witnessed other people kind of navigating those dynamics. I know of an estate that hasn't happened yet, but I do know the estate plan. And I am hopeful for that family, but it's a lot of beneficiaries. I mean, once you get 3 plus, oh, good luck. And this particular estate is a lot of land with a lot of beneficiaries. And I think the intention is that the land will be sold. But then what if people don't want to sell the land? What if they want to keep it? And what land are they going to be allowed to keep? I mean, so then you need to consider there needs to be an arm's length transaction. If you want to keep some of this land, you're going to have to buy it at the appraised value, or what acres do you want to buy? Do you want it with buildings on it or not? So I don't know that I'll be involved in that administration, but that's something that I think about. Just like one of those things, like the Roman Empire that pops into my mind. I think about that estate plan and what's
We had maybe not quite as much land, but it was about 300 acres with buildings on it, and eight different family members, mostly cousins, inheriting, all with different desires. One of the cousins was the executor and got to decide how they wanted to make. And the will, the cousin had even gotten the uncle to write the will in such a way to say, if you sue, there's this is pretty common in wills to say, like, if you dispute any of the terms of the will, then you lose your, or you lose your share. The problem was the disputes weren't with the will itself. The disputes were with how the executor was managing it. Like, you're not acting like a fiduciary, right? But I think
right.
I completely see that, where you get beyond a certain number of beneficiaries, and the beneficiaries already don't have maybe a close relationship. Maybe things have broken down, and then there's just infighting and griping and frustration and accusing one another of malfeasance. And so, yeah, I think oftentimes, and I do, what I also saw was some wanted to divide the land in a way like, well, I want my share of the land. I don't want it sold at the prices are down right now. I don't want to fire sale it because you're trying to sell it all at once. And that, yeah, it's just it is a sad reality in those situations.
Well, and it's great that you have this amazing asset, maybe it's hundreds of acres that have been in your family for generations. It's amazing that you have this opportunity, but at some point, unfortunately, you're going to have to make some really tough calls. Who's going to inherit it? Is it going to be sold? How is this going to look when I'm no longer here? Because I think what people don't realize, I feel like we should all realize this, but I don't think everyone does realize that when you're sitting in a chair and you're with your kids or you're with your grandkids, and the way they interact in front of their grandparents or their parents is going to be different when that grandparent and that parent is no longer there. And that's just because the dynamic has shifted. There is not, I don't want to say a leader, but sometimes we behave in certain ways in front of our parents or our grandparents or our uncle or whoever the person is that is kind of holding that family unit together. And then when that person passes away, those unhealthy and toxic dynamics just kind of mushroom. And then your executor, your attorney, your family members are left to deal with kind of the consequences of that or the reality of this situation. If someone says, I don't want to share property with person B, believe them. They don't want to share property with that person. There's a reason. Don't force it.
Exactly.
It's just as we age, there are all kinds, and not estate planning, to be clear, is not for the elderly. It is a process that you need to refine. It's active, and you need to reevaluate your assets, reevaluate your beneficiaries. It's not a one and done thing. I know, like, for example, my own parents did their wills, I don't know, when I was in elementary school, and didn't make any changes to it until like within the last, 5 or 10 years. Things change, you know? So it's a process that you constantly have to be reevaluated.
Even on a basic level, what are some of those tips you give people, either about things they should do earlier on or things that they should think about, or maybe it's even funny things that you see as problems once people have passed on and you're dealing with their stuff?
Okay. So I'm going to do this from an estate administrative perspective because that sometimes that's more fun. When I go into an estate and I go through someone's belongings, I immediately go home and I start throwing some of my own stuff away. I go through drawers and I started throwing things away because nobody wants to go through s- stuff. Like I told my mom recently, I was like, you and all of your friends need to find your foreign coin and get rid of them because they're such a pain to deal with later. If you think you have a stamp collection or a coin collection that's worth a lot of money, go ahead and talk to someone. Get that appraised. And if you find out that's not worth anything, consider just moving on and donating it to a library or something because they're just like little things that get, at least for me personally, I get stuck on the foreign currency that inevitably, unless they're coup grands, the coins aren't worth as much as you think they're going to be. The things you think are going to be worth a lot of money are not going to be worth a lot of money. It's unfortunate. It's happened for all of us. And just clean stuff out on occasion. You know, I was going to buy something this weekend that is important to me. So, quick story, when my grandmother and I went to the same high school, and when she passed away, I just wanted her yearbook. I didn't get her yearbook. I don't know what happened to it. Doesn't matter. So, but all of a sudden, I thought one day I'll Google it, and I found one for sale on eBay. Her year, school, $50. $50, but okay. And then I thought, but who's gonna want this? Like, once, if something happened to me, what's gonna happen to this? Nobody wants this after you. I have found usually with family history, there's one person. It's usually just one person who's into the family history. So maybe if you're organizing things, think about who is going to be that one person, because I'm sure I can identify them, and my nieces and nephews are under the age of 18. But I know who's going to care and have conversations with that person and give them some of this stuff now. So I don't know if that answers your
It
question,
does.
but it's the stuff. Thrift stores are where coffee mugs go to die. I stop buying them as gifts for people. They end up at Goodwill
That's so funny.
because, and I'm not trying to take the joy out of things, but there's just, I think that administering estates, and I like thrifting, and Matt knows I like old stuff, but it's stuff. So I think that is like a philosophical, like life lesson that you cannot take it with you. It will still be here when you're not. And so I've had this discussion with one of my friends who he said he used to go to estate sales all the time. And then one time he's at an estate sale and he was like, but I'm not trying to go dark, but this is what's left. Your stuff goes into an estate sale. And it's not because people don't care about you. And it's not because you weren't important. It's because your legacy is not your stuff.
That's exactly right.
Your legacy is those relationships that you've built with people and the experiences that you have had with them. So when you go shopping, please remember that. And that eventually, truly, it's all that's left at the end. It's stuff. And the impressions you've made on the people around you. And so anyway, I implement that in my own life. And I've done the whole like 2 in, 2 out thing. I'm not buying anything else anymore. If I buy it, something else got to go. And that would now go hoarding, anti-hoarding platform.
Honestly, a lot of people need to hear it. I also have to remind myself, I enjoy walking into those situations because it is a good lesson where you're like, I need less stuff. I've got to, I mean, you can see my walls. Like I even like one of my to-do items is there's probably half these books I don't need anymore, right? There's always things like I just told my wife, I was like, we are going to do spring cleaning in the last quarter. We got to get rid of some stuff. Like we've accumulated too much. But one of the things I do tell people, and because I say, well, why do we accumulate stuff? I do think there's something about stuff that's like appealing to us and we just love having it, and there's something, but I also think sometimes, especially when we're unwilling to get rid of it, because I can find stuff in my house where I'm like, I don't need this anymore, I'm happy to get rid of it. But then there's other things that people tend to hold on to, and I think the older you get, the more that you hold on to things that are no longer doing anything for you but mean something. And so what I often tell people who are maybe transitioning to senior living, or like before they've passed on, right? They're still thinking about, how do I start making my life ready to pass on to the next generation? I say, I agree with you. Find the things that are memorable that someone might care about and give them to them now. My grandfather did a great job of that. He gave me some amazing family heirlooms. He gave my aunts and uncle, my aunts and my dad, a number of family heirlooms as well. But I got some specific ones because I was the oldest grandchild. But one of the things that I think is really important is when you're passing those things on, to recognize the reason that you might even be holding on to it is because you have memories attached to it, or you believe your memories are attached to it. And your sadness is, if I get rid of this, or if I let it go, then I'm no longer who I was, or I no longer get to remember what I did, or these things that made my life meaningful. And now the stuff feels like it's got meaning attached to it. But that's actually not true. Like you said, that's not who your stuff is, not who you are. Your relationships are who you are. So let the stuff serve as a reminder of the memory, maybe write down the memory, maybe share the memory with a family member, and then kind of like a Marie Kondo sort of like, let me think the stuff and pass it on to Goodwill or to somebody else that can use it. And oftentimes I see this a lot as people get older, moving from a grand house or a house with many things into a smaller house, or into a room, or to senior living, or whatever the situation is, whatever that transition, it's very hard to feel like you're losing control, or that your life you're losing what felt like your life. And it can feel like the stuff is the representation of your life. I've seen this with my own family members, where they want to bring, and you'll see this at high-end senior living as well, where the room is full of all the nice antiques and the pieces of, like, you literally just moved as much of your house as you could to your new place, and you're living because you don't want to let go of your previous life. But it's a very emotional and spiritual process that you have to go through to recognize you are dying, and holding onto your stuff is not going to make your life last longer. But you can make it meaningful, to connect with the relationships you have, and to make it as relational of a last time as possible, not about the stuff. So I agree with you, and I also want to get rid of some stuff. I'm still young, of course, but you never know. You could die at any point. All of us could die at any moment. And then what stuff is left undone, or for someone else to have to, and it becomes a burden for them, right? Oftentimes you name someone as an executor because you're like, they're the person that's going to really take care of everything, but now you've given them a job for the next year and a half. and a burden, right? So it's like, could you make it lighter and
Right.
easier for them? Are there any other structures or tools or estate planning tips that you recommend, especially thinking about how somebody could how their estate or trust is going to operate afterwards? Like, are there any of those vehicles or systems that you recommend for people to consider on the front end?
So you mentioned that you're young, and there is one thing I want to touch on, and it is about people. I know people who are young, under the age of 50. Some people would say under the age of 40, but for my purposes, it's under the age of 50. And you need a will. I know you don't think you do. I know you don't think you have a lot of assets, but you should have a will, because for the reason that you just stated, you never know. You don't know, and you don't know how. So you may not have assets now. Heaven forbid an accident should happen. Maybe you become incapacitated, but you have a settlement from that. Or there's a survival claim by your estate because you were killed in a tractor trailer accident. Now you have a lot of assets. And if you don't have a will, those assets might go someplace you don't want them to go. So I'll give an example. I had an individual who was very intelligent, but also very intelligent and did not think he needed to engage an attorney to do his will. So he did a holographic will. Holographic wills are handwritten wills. And if they're in the proper form in the state of Texas, they will be probated and they will be accepted. The beneficiaries in his will were his friend, not family. They were his friend. And keep in mind that if someone dies without a will, their assets pass through intestacy statute in whatever state they live in. And usually it's family members. It's not your friends in the intestacy statute. So this individual passed away with a handwritten will, and his beneficiaries were his friends and a couple of charities. But he didn't consult with an attorney. And he had a piece of real estate in Florida. Florida does not recognize holographic wills. So when you have a piece of property in another state, you generally have to open an ancillary probate in that estate, depending on what your plan is. So Florida doesn't recognize holographic wills. So that piece of property passed by in Florida intestate statute to his brother. His brother passed away after he did. So it went to his sister-in-law. And so this property went to someone that wasn't even in his estate plan. But if he had consulted with an attorney, and there are attorneys that don't charge thousands of dollars to do a basic will. And it could have been avoided if he had just taken that time. So that's an example of not having a document, but you could also be 30 years old and on an interstate, and, unfortunately happens all the time. We all see the TV commercials, but you could have an accident with a semi and there may be a settlement, especially if you survive that accident. So you never know. So if you are able to get a written will, then I suggest that you really need to do that. So as far as tips and tricks, okay, so one thing is a lot of people create what's called a rev trust. It's called a revocable trust. It's how it sounds. You can revoke it at any time. You add your assets to the trust. And one of the benefits of that is kind of, if you lose capacity, you can include provisions of what happens in your incapacity. But people often will create revocable trust, will retitle assets in the name of the trust, and then they will buy something new, a new house, a new car, or open a new investment account, and then they won't retitle it. It's a process. You have to keep doing it. So if you do a revocable trust, please make sure that it's not just a one and done. You have to continually retitle those assets in the name of your revocable trust. And if you're trying to avoid probate and you haven't done that, oftentimes you will still have to open probate to get some of those ancillary assets moved. Not always, there are other alternatives, but sometimes probate will have to be opened.
That's a great point.
Another thing that I think people of a high net worth means should consider is, and I don't know, I go to a lot of community foundation events where they talk about charitable giving and whether attorneys and estate planners really talk to their clients about charitable giving. But think about your charitable giving. And I think one of the most underutilized tools is a charitable remainder trust, where you can create a trust for a term of years or a lifetime of a beneficiary, and they receive annual distributions of a fixed amount. And at the end, the money goes to charity. This allows you, to me, this is two birds, one stone. You're able to benefit somebody you care about, a family member, a friend, or whomever, and you're able to benefit a cause, a school, a cause that you really care about. So I think that if you don't remember anything, remember charitable remainder trust and go ask your attorney about what that lady was talking about on that podcast, because I don't think it's used enough.
I've heard briefly of CRTs, and I've heard that they're good. I've not dove into it as much. But the other thing that I've recently heard about, and I think you've even mentioned it, is donor advised funds, which is another opportunity there. What do you know about donor advised funds?
So unless you are going to fund a private foundation with tens of millions of dollars, you're going to have an office managing it. I do not recommend a private foundation. I think that you can achieve your charitable goals using a DAF. This DAF is a donor advised fund and is often held by a community foundation. We have, especially in the Dallas area, we have multiple community foundations. I'm on the professional advisor. I'm on several committees with the Southwest Community Foundation here in Dallas. And the only difference is going to be less administration and less cost if you have a DAF versus a private foundation. You still get to say where the money goes. You still have a little bit of, maybe one year you don't give anything to anyone. You don't have that option with the private foundation because you have a required amount you have to give every single year. You have tax returns you have to file. You have investment expenses that you have to pay for. It's less expensive and less administratively burdensome to have a donor advised fund than to have a private foundation. So and that is not something you have to do in your estate. You can do that during your life as well. For example, I heard an example at Southwest Community Foundation about a woman who gave a fixed amount to a charity during her life every year, but then she created DAF, and that charity is still continuing to benefit from that DAF after she's passed away because she contributed assets to continue to give to that charity. So I think people should consider their charitable, what is important to you, what causes, what schools is important to you. Maybe you went to school and you received a lot of financial aid and you want to give back and pay it forward to other students. Think about those things when you're doing when you're doing your estate plan in general. But I know, like, I personally am like, oh, if I won the lottery, all I can think about is who would I give money away to? Like, that's one of the first things I think about. And then I've had meetings with people at community foundations who say some people have never even thought about who they want to give money to. That kind of surprises me. So anyway, that's a long answer to your very simple question, but I really want to encourage people to investigate donor advised funds, especially with community foundations, and instead of doing a private foundation.
Well, and whether it's in your estate or whether you do it beforehand, you're removing that asset from your estate value. So
Right.
so especially, and I realize not everyone is going to, now I think it's 15 million and 30 million for a spouse for 2026. Not everyone's going to hit that estate value. But if you are going to be over that estate value, a donor advised fund's almost a no-brainer for removing the excess estate value rather than paying 40% to the government. If you're going to give, either you could give directly charitably, or you could, if you go through a donor advised fund, then your beneficiaries, the people that, I mean, they're not a beneficiary of the donor advised fund, but your heirs, the most common phrase, your heirs could even be the ones that are then advising the fund to direct those distributions every year to charities that they choose, right? So it's almost like they get both some of your estate in an actual inheritance, and then they get the ability to then direct the charitable funds for another, for indefinitely, especially if you've put a significant amount of money in there, and there's a lot of build up each year that they can then use to distribute to the charities of their choice. I think that's such a neat thing to be able to inherit. Like I would almost rather inherit a donor advised funds that I can then every year go give away at wherever I go, right? Versus a bunch of money that then I have to deal with the tax and the investment consequences and all the other things. I've recently started studying that. I'm like, this is a no-brainer if you're going to be above the estate value and you're trying to figure out what to do with the excess, and you haven't been planning well and putting things in irrevocable trusts and getting stuff out of, say, like if you get to a point where you cannot get any more out and you're trying to find what to do with the extra 10 million, maybe look at a foundation, but look at a donor advised fund, and then allow your heirs to go be super charitable in their communities.
Or if you have 20 million, and it doesn't have to be 20 million. You don't have to have millions to open a donor advised fund. But let's say you are over the estate tax exemption by like 20 million. You're thinking at the time you're doing your planning, create a charitable remainder trust for that 20 million, benefit someone for, a term of years or their life, and they'll receive income. And then the remainder can go to the charity of your choice. If you have that 20 million beyond the estate tax exemption, consider a charitable remainder trust. And then you can benefit your beneficiaries with income and benefit a charity, and you get a charitable deduction for your estate tax return. Another tip or trick I just recently learned, the Dallas Shush Community Foundation and Southwest Community Foundation are one and the same. And we recently had our professional advisor seminar. And Paul Kasperson was a speaker at the seminar, and it was about charitable giving, but it was also about AI. One of the things, though, he talked about that I didn't realize is you can extend the life of your IRA, your inherited IRA, if you make the beneficiary a charitable remainder trust. And what that means is no one's being taxed. There's a big tax bill a lot with inherited IRAs, especially if you haven't done the correct planning. And that person that you've left your IRA to is likely going to have to take those funds out over 10 years. There are exceptions to that rule, but for purposes of this discussion, we'll say inherited IRAs have to be spent down in 10 years. But if you have a large IRA, you can leave it to a charitable remainder trust, benefit your daughter, your nephew, your godson, whoever you want, for a term of years of their life. And to go beyond that 10 years, you've escaped that huge tax bill, and the money will go to charity at the end of the lifetime or the term of years. So it's a really good way, that charitable remainder trust, just again, so many goals achieved with that. You're avoiding tax, you're giving to your beneficiaries, and you're giving to a cause that you care about, and you're getting a charitable, how can that wins for everyone, in my opinion. So, and that's a planning technique. I want to give credit where credit is due, mentioned by Natalie Choate on an ActTech podcast. And Paul Kasperson brought it up at the seminar. So anyway.
I love that. Well, Sarah, how can people connect with you? Where can they go to find more out about what you guys do for trusts, or to find out more about the bank? How can they connect with you?
Well, I think the best way is to find me on LinkedIn and reach out, send me a message, and I can reach out to you. And I'm at the American National Bank and Trust. We have offices in Houston and Fort Worth and Dallas. I'm in Denton, but I may have contacts in Dallas and have Dallas business. So, but I would say find me on LinkedIn, connect with me, send me a message, and I'd love to talk to people. I often offer, even if you don't want to use a corporate trustee and you just want me to look at a document to say, well, this could be an issue, please reach out.
That's it for today's episode of the Wealth Transfer Podcast. If you found value in this conversation, would you leave us a review? That would be just so honoring to us. We'd appreciate it. And if you know somebody who might need to listen to this because they're thinking about their next chapter, will you send them a link to this podcast or this video so that they can listen more as well? For more episodes and expert insights, be sure to follow and subscribe. That means the most to us. Follow and subscribe, please, please, please. And when you're ready to take action on your own real estate plan, or if you need help with wealth transfer planning, we know a number of experts in all the different spaces. We'd love to connect you with them. You can reach out to us via direct message or comment. You can email us, matt@templeton.realestate. No .com, just templeton.realestate. And I'd be happy to connect you with an advisor. Thanks so much.